Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Today, I am joined once again, and I'm very happy about it, by my dear friend and neighbor, Steve McIntosh. Hey Steve, how you doing, man?
Hi Jeff, good to be with you again. Thanks for having me on your program.
Yeah, my pleasure. And it's a beautiful day here in Boulder. Beautiful early summer day, just perfect.
Yeah.
And through the magic of Zoom technology, it may seem like Steve and I are talking right next to each other, but actually we are hundreds of feet away.
Stone's throw.
Yeah, exactly. Steve's my neighbor, so it's really cool. So anyway, it feels like a nice topic today for an afternoon because it's just a little bigger topic. It's a contextual topic, and we want to talk today about the history of integral thought. And I love the topic because, first of all, I don't really know that much about it. I haven't, or at least I don't feel like I've downloaded it. And to the degree that I do, it really helps me to ground myself in what I'm doing and what we're doing in terms of moving a stream of thought forward that actually has a history and has building blocks and has really cool people. And you have been my best teacher in all of this. And I would say that started with a chapter in your first book called Integral Consciousness, which I love. And you laid it out with pictures and it was all cool. But that was 3 books ago. I imagine you've done some thinking about it since. So let's just get into it. And so we'll start with, some just general orientation of what is integral philosophy and how can we sort of chart its movement and evolution, indeed.
Sure. Well, certainly whatever integral is, it's more than philosophy. From my understanding, integral's a label among others. It's probably the leading label for an emerging stage or structure of consciousness, right? And so when we talk about structures of consciousness, according to the theory itself, we're also necessarily talking about structures of culture, right? Social structures of history, if you will. And so the question of what is integral begins by saying it's a sort of worldview. And there's lots of different ways of thinking about culture, many different sources of culture. But worldviews as these sort of structures of agreement that have a systemic, self-organizing element to them, they exist primarily in this intersubjective realm. Of course, they penetrate our minds and they penetrate the objective world. But what's so significant about worldviews, what makes this frame so powerful as a sort of foundation for integral, is that we're for the last 300 years of human civilization, the most significant thing that's happened to us, of course, is the birth of modernity, right? Modernism, the orange meme, as it's sometimes referred to, right? And this, of course, has changed humanity in ways that we kind of take for granted. We don't really appreciate what living in modernity means compared to what it would be like.
I know, you just turn the spigot and the water runs.
Yeah.
Turn on a light.
Now, of course, many of us are focused on overcoming modernity's pathologies, right? Environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation, inequality, all these things that have been the downsides of modernism. But if we ask what modernism is, I think the best answer is it's a worldview, more than anything else. And so since modernity emerged 300 years ago, the question is, well, modernity is a worldview that comes after, right, the traditional worldview and the pre-traditional worldview. I mean, there seems to be this evolution by steps or stages in culture, although there's lines and it's all very messy. We don't want to talk about a linear history.
But there is one thing that, as I was reviewing your chapter, that I really loved, and I just want to put it in here in case you aren't. And that is when you talk about modernity, there was a sort of a proto-modern blast into the planet back with the Greeks. And you talk about that.
Yeah, yeah. So
one of the things they did was they differentiated philosophy from spirituality. And so philosophy, that was really the birth of philosophy. And it's sort of, the Dark Ages come in and it got buried and then it's revived. And but I love that because that's, I guess it's not, specifically integral history, but it's the history of philosophy. And so I thought it was
sure.
great.
And of course, that's, other people who dispute that. So it's important to put a little context on that. But so I'll get to that.
Just quoted Steve McIntosh.
I'll get to that in just a second. All right.
All right.
So integral. It's this way of seeing. It's a perspective, right? It's a theory. It's a worldview. It's a stage of consciousness. It's all these things. But at its root, it shows many parallels to the birth of modernism, right? So in other words, modernity came about through all kinds of different, science and the Reformation and all the Renaissance, all those things. But one of the primary catalysts of modernity was a new philosophical viewpoint, right? That philosophy started to become independent of religion. It could think independently. And then you had this series of geniuses, right? Bacon, Descartes, Locke, and all of these famous philosophers who sort of contributed to what's known as the Enlightenment, right? The birth of modernity in the 16 and 1700s. And what's interesting, getting back to your point about the Greeks, all the major religious civilizations had influential and brilliant philosophers, right? So we can certainly see philosophy in ancient Islam and ancient China, in ancient India, of course. And those all are legitimate philosophers who need our recognition. But what makes the Greeks kind of stand out from that list of the philosophies of antiquity is that I think more than these other great civilizations, even though they had geniuses who came into a kind of a rational perspective and began to look scientifically at the world, the Greeks did it with more success. And the proof of that is that the ancient Greek philosophy continues to be extremely influential in the philosophy of the mainstream developed world, right? Much more so than any of the other philosophers. And it might be just because of Western bias, but the West is the root of modernity, so we have to give credit to the Greeks. And I think that what's most interesting about the Greeks is that because their spirituality was extremely mythic, right? It wasn't well developed. I mean, compared to like the Jews, right?
This blasted out of
Jerusalem and Athens as the major contributors, right, to Western civilization. And so the Jews had a very well developed religion, and the Greeks, their religion was pretty pathetic by comparison. And yet their philosophy. Wait a second, Steve. I mean, wouldn't you say that? I mean, pathetic, but and I get it, but. Basically a stage earlier. It was superheroes. It was red. It was, yeah, right. It wasn't
gods in the sky.
So I mean, again, that's anyone. We're skimming across the surface here.
But in a way that makes it all the more amazing that this blast of modernity comes out of this mythic, thing. Right. And anyway.
Right. So the Greeks, beginning with what's known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, began to ask the questions rationally and scientifically. They were the first to, in some ways, or among the first, to kind of try to part the veil of myth and say, what is it that's real, right? From without any fanciful, they could see beyond it. And so they begin to ask questions about the nature of reality. And this led to this series of philosophers known as the pre-Socratics. For our purposes, the most significant of them was a Greek philosopher named Anaximander. And he's really credited as the first to recognize evolution. He could see that the world was a process of becoming. Right?
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. So now there's a very dim view of what we understand of evolution.
What was his name? What was his name?
Anaximander. Anaximander.
Anaximander. Okay,
yeah,
great.
Yeah. And so, of course, then the golden age of ancient Greece, we have these geniuses, right? 3 in a row: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. 1, 2, 3, in terms of Socrates being Plato's mentor and Plato being Aristotle's mentor. And perhaps more than any other, Plato was, in a sense, the avatar of modernist consciousness, right? Him and Aristotle really brought this rational consciousness to bear like it had never been unveiled before. And that led to this philosophy, which is very important foundation for Western civilization, right? And so, of course, the proto-modernist consciousness of the Greeks was not sustainable. It went under the waves of history. You see some of it carried forward in the Romans for sure, but with the death of antiquity and the Dark Ages, all that was lost. The recovery of it is sort of what began the rebirth of Western civilization, right? It was the recovery of the wisdom of antiquity and the sort of scientific proto-modernist consciousness that they had. That
so like logic, mathematics, the idea
engineering,
of understanding the world in its own terms, not just through the mythic books and legends.
Right. And beginning to not only to distinguish science from philosophy, but being able to identify branches of science, like physics, biology, mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really a branch of science, but they were definitely differentiating in all kinds of very interesting and precocious ways.
Wow. So then, how many? So then, we have this restoration. When, and how long was it lost?
Well, there were parts of, for example, Aristotle that were known to the medieval thinkers. Like, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s was very much aware of Aristotle, but a big part of the canon of Greek understanding was much more preserved by the ancient Islamic civilization. And so in 1453, when the Ottoman Turks sacked Constantinople, many of the scholars who were part of the Byzantine Empire fled to the courts of Europe and brought with them in many of these Islamic translations of the ancient Greeks. And so there was a sort of seeding, watering of the seeds of wisdom that occurred.
Wow.
That was a major catalyst of the Renaissance, right? Which then had to create the Reformation before we could make way for the Enlightenment, right? But again, this is a whole...
Well, that's good. That helps me because I'm also thinking that's when Columbus sailed the ocean blue,
right,
late 1400s.
The Age of Discovery that was a kind of an offshoot of the Renaissance.
Yes.
Definitely.
Okay. So cool.
I think that that the structure of evolution that we recognize not only in the periodic table of elements and the biological tree of life, but also in a vague way within human history, that this, I don't think it's predetermined, but I do think that we can observe what I like to call harmonics. So when in musical harmonics, when you hit a note, then you can often hear faint traces of the notes that are above it on the scale, right? Like the fifth above it. And so that's a very interesting and spiritually intriguing proposition about the basic vibration of music. And I think we can see something very similar in the evolution of consciousness in the sense that the higher harmonic, right, of integralism can be seen within modernity, right? Modernism, right at its birth, shows proto-examples of both postmodernism and this integral stage that comes after postmodernism. And we can see it in Hegel. Now,
all right, so Hegel. So
in the book, right, in my chapter 7, in part 2 of Integral Consciousness, I have a 45-page history, intellectual history of the founders of integral philosophy, as I call it. And I think many of these people can be traced. I think we can make arguments as to why they are significant, why we could name hundreds of people. There's many different lines that converge into integral. But I think that the most significant line of it is in this understanding of evolution. What is the meaning of evolution? Not just the recognition of the fact of the descent with modification of the species, but the fact that the universe is evolving, and what does that mean? What are the spiritual implications of that? That, in some ways, is sort of the root of this integral understanding. Because modernism was born before evolution was understood. And it was only really when evolution started to be realized, that's kind of what brought about these proto-understandings of integralism, right? So Hegel is among a school of philosophers, the idealist philosophers, including Fichte and Schelling and other important philosophers. And they were reacting to, in some ways, the culmination of modernist philosophy in Kant, right? Their goal of the idealists was to try to complete Kant's system. There he is. I have a picture of, this is the famous portrait of Hegel. I have a picture of him on the wall at my house. And
I know your house is so cool. You have
people
all
come
these
in and they say,
philosophers.
well, who is that? And I say, oh, that's a Halloween decoration. It scares away the little kids.
Yeah.
um, but
he was a really good thinker. Not
right.
not a
And,
not a
he died
looker,
in
but a good thinker.
1831. And his first book, and I think his most significant book, was published in 1807.
Okay.
And that was called The Phenomenology of Spirit. And Hegel was just sort of this giant meteor of genius in history, right? I mean, even though he was surrounded by others, even though evolution was really first realized around the same time as creative evolution of phenomenology of spirit by Lamarck, right? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. But he was looking at species, and he was being very scientific, and he didn't think there were any spiritual implications to evolution whatsoever, right? Hegel really didn't even concern himself with the evolution of species. He was more concerned about the evolution of history, right? The unfolding of history, which he kind of framed as the movement of spirit in the world, right? And so from the very beginning, one of the things that Hegel was most concerned about was the structure process of evolution, right? Which he described as this dialectic, the dialectic of development. Where there's a kind of a stage or a condition of history. And in order to break out of that condition, there's forces that move beyond it that can't deal with the internal contradictions within that. They move beyond it and they kind of negate it. There's a negation of the condition and a kind of a protest against it. But then that creates a tension which itself brings about a negation of the negation, as you call it. In other words, a moderation of the antithesis, of that which is kind of moving away, that tries to preserve the best of both and carry them forward, even in a sense preserve the conflict to a degree. So it's complex and deep, and in some ways deeply profound. So if Hegel would say things like, the truth is merely the dialectical movement. Which I just appreciate so much, because
that's
he's talking about truth as a direction of evolution.
Yes. Yes.
And the fact that he was so
and truth itself evolves.
Yeah.
Through that process. Yes.
Yeah. Later, Roy Bhaskar would call it dialectic pulse of freedom. Like freedom pulses and it breaks out. Right.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So anyway, this concern with both the process and the structure of how spirit moves in the world and brings about these stages which contradict each other and then resolve each other. This was a giant genius move by Hegel, and it completely rocked the Western world, right? For several decades after Hegel.
He was convincing.
Yeah, he was not only convincing, he was compelling. Right? And although eventually critics arose, like Kierkegaard and others, who Hegel was, in some ways, both the completion of modernity and the transcendence of modernity through this kind of proto-integral move.
And we're talking again early 1800s.
Yeah. But, between 1807 when he published his first book until 1831 when he died. So Hegel, of course, brings about a revolution in philosophy that soon his followers are divided into a left wing and a right wing. Right, the left wing becomes Marxism. And the right wing, according to some, becomes fascism, right? So, Hegel's imprint on human history is hard to overestimate. But there was also ways in which it couldn't be sustained. It was too fantastic. It was too metaphysical, right? It was too authoritatively proclaimed. And so, he didn't reach all the way down to the ground in certain ways, right? So, that's why we can't describe integral philosophy as strictly Hegelian, or maybe not even in the line of Hegelian philosophy, right? There are some neo-Hegelians, there are some professional academic philosophers who call themselves Hegelians, but it's very niched out. By and large, he's been tremendously influential, but his philosophy is kind of not a living philosophy at this point in a serious way. So then, of course, we have the turbulent 19th century, where Hegel's view of evolution as a process of historical development in human society is then itself significantly impacted by the discovery or the proof of biological evolution, right? Lamarck had posited it, but he didn't have a mechanism, right? That giraffes got their long necks by stretching, right? Lamarckian evolution. That was wrong, right? So Darwin and at the same time Alfred Wallace, they recognized that it's mutation followed by natural selection, and that this provides this very satisfying process, at least for those who are looking for a satisfying modernist creation story. It seems to explain things in such a beautiful way that there's no need for religion, and that was really why Darwin was so influential and popular. I mean, not only was his theory interesting and good and scientific, and not only did he make a significant contribution to history, but his contribution to the overthrow of religious authority was far more significant than his actual theory of natural selection.
They still don't really like it.
All right.
So then this is now when?
1859 is on.
All right. So, pre-Civil War over here. And
right.
So this going on over there. All right.
So throughout the 19th century, we had these what's now framed as Victorian evolutionism, right? Which was kind of used for the purposes of justifying colonialism, right? One of the major proponents of this evolutionism, which combined the evolution of history with the evolution of life, was Herbert Spencer, right? The founder of The Economist magazine.
Really? Did you give me one of his pictures? No.
Spencer was the guy who coined the term survival of the fittest. And he's really, in some ways, the father of social Darwinism, right? Which is a very dark term in this idea of cultural evolution. And by the turn of the 20th century, there were many sensitive people who began to think that not only was colonialism immoral, but these theories of evolution, which sort of tried to reduce the unfolding of human civilization as some kind of turn-crank material process that was just, going inexorably forward like biological evolution, right? So a huge contributor to integral philosophy, sort of the next great person that I mentioned in the book and whose picture I put up will do so, is Henri Bergson.
And there he is.
There he is. Yeah, looking like a good Victorian himself. So Bergson's book, Creative Evolution, came out exactly 100 years after Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Right? His book kind of, many people at the time, especially people who had a spiritual orientation, were sort of in despair over this highly materialistic account of human origins and this dethroning of any kind of spiritually fragrant creation story. And what Bergson did is he sort of brought back spirituality to evolution and actually realized that what we now are coming to find, what they were in 1907, coming to find out about evolution, was in fact a tremendous spiritual teaching, right? And so Bergson was, very, very easy to read. He was very lively. One of his major points was, instead of being analytical, we need to use our sort of intuition to intuit the whole. Right, he sort of recognized that the entire universe was a process. Right, he called it durée, or duration. Right, like, so that as everything is moving, and so even matter is just sort of habituated experience. And so he had a kind of radical process view of reality, and he's most famous for his idea of élan vital, right, or the vital spirit, life force, which of course.
And where was he writing and when again?
He's a Frenchman, and he wrote around the turn of the 20th century.
Okay. All right. And then
his most significant book, which is called Creative Evolution, was published in 1907.
Okay. Is he a priest? Is that a priest collar I'm seeing?
No.
In that picture? Okay.
No. That's just bad stuff.
No, it's a nice collar.
So Bergson was a philosopher. He was of Jewish origin. He was an atheist, but in his later life, he converted to Catholicism. And
interesting.
He had this fantastic spiritual view of evolution, and he's really fun to read. And even though not many people know of him in the integral movement, he's not talked about quite very much, but he's nevertheless one of the major founders, primarily because he had a significant influence on two of the major founders, which are both Alfred North Whitehead and Teilhard de Chardin. Even though Whitehead and Teilhard didn't really notice each other or read each other or talk about each other, never mentioned each other, so we have to assume they didn't really know about each other. They both were significantly influenced by Bergson and wanted to try to complete or extend Bergson's philosophy, right? So Whitehead, of course, is one of the great geniuses of history. Independent of integral philosophy, he's certainly recognized as one of the great philosophers of all time. Because of his spiritual orientation, he gets sort of short shrift in professional philosophy, which has a fashion of atheism at the moment. Right. But I think in the 21st century, Whitehead will be far more appreciated than he was in the 20th century in his own time.
Is that also true for Bergson?
No, Bergson's not nowhere near as big a genius as Whitehead.
But is he recognized academically? Is he seen as part of it?
Bergson's in the canon of mainstream philosophy for sure.
Right, right.
So Whitehead, his major work is called Process and Reality, and that was published in 1929. And Whitehead was a Neoplatonist, meaning that he was very influenced by Plato, but yet his view of evolution was he sort of tried to rethink the whole metaphysics of modernity in general, right? By instead of thinking of in a Cartesian way, as there's this extended realm of matter and there's this internal realm of mind. He kind of rejected all that, and he had a very consciousness-centric view of what the universe is, right? So he tried to think about entire reality as a process, and it's impossible to try to summarize Whitehead in this context, but he talks about occasions of experience, that the reality consists of occasions of experience, which both inherit the past and contribute to the future. But one of my favorite quotes from Whitehead, or it's not quite a quote, but it's an idea from Whitehead, and that is that evolutionary growth can best be understood as an increase in the capacity to experience what is intrinsically valuable. It's a very consciousness-centric definition of evolution.
Yeah, say that again, Steve.
A growth in the ability to experience what is valuable.
What is?
Evolution.
Evolution, okay.
Yeah, or evolutionary growth.
Okay.
Right? Meaning that he looks at it primarily as the growth of these occasions of experience, the growth in those occasions of their ability to apprehend or receive intrinsic value, which he, of course, framed as goodness, truth, and beauty, right? Taking forward Plato's philosophy, but more so than Hegel or more so than Bergson, Whitehead was a major proponent of goodness, truth, and beauty, and it figures prominently in his philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm also a proponent of those primary values, I have a particular affinity for Whitehead. But unlike Hegel or Bergson, Whitehead's philosophy continues to have life and vitality today.
Mm-hmm.
Claremont.
Well, I know a little bit about it, and here's how it has a vitality for me. And it's from a talk that Ken Wilber, and where he talked about that Whitehead talked just what you said, that there's a moment, and then there's a new moment that comes after it, and in the middle of that is an opportunity for novelty, an opportunity for creativity.
Well, where freedom exists, where consciousness exists.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's that moment that makes it more complex than it was, and so I don't know, that feels like downloadable somehow into my psyche and into my way of life, and just thinking about things.
Right. So one of the things that's good, that's important to say, is that I think that people who aspire to be integralists, who want to make meaning at this emergent stage of consciousness, that the key thing about what makes this different from what came before is that it contains a new truth, right? The integral frame, the integral perspective has a new truth, which gives us new light and new power to understand the evolution of consciousness and culture, right?
Yeah.
So in order, if you want to grasp this truth and make it part of who you are, you got to do the practice, right? So the practice of this new truth involves learning and teaching, right? It's a metabolism of the value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that means that the key root of this new truth is in the philosophical line that contributes to integral philosophy. So this integral stage is more than a philosophy, as I said. Philosophy is a line that contributes to it. We can also identify psychology and science and religion and many other important strains that we're not talking about today. But it's, again, this is like part of the trunk line, so it's worth focusing on.
Right. And instead of being a philosophy or merely a philosophy, what you would say it is a movement of history.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Like Hegel said, it's the movement of the dialectic. Yeah. So if we're going to do the practice and circuit the truth, right, there's a certain amount of reading of these folks that is recommended, right? So people, a lot of times they ask me when I give a talk, well, can you give us a reading list, right? And so I mentioned some books. There's a reading list on my blog from a couple of years ago. But the reason that I want to try to talk about these, one of the good things is that I recommend that people go and they spend a little time reading about these philosophers. Especially now, we have the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a really tremendous online resource that I think all integralists should know about and become familiar with, because it's peer-reviewed, it's generally excellent, it's not like Wikipedia or something. This is a more serious academic philosophy, and it's highly intellectual, but it's accessible to most people. And you could read about Hegel and Bergson free. They're online, right?
Right.
Of course.
And this is the Stanford, what now?
Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Got it.
Just Google that, right? So, for example, reading Hegel in the original, that is rough going, right? I mean, it's worth doing just for fun, like skiing a double black diamond for the first time, You might fall down, but what the hell, right? But when it comes to Hegel, there are plenty of interpreters of Hegel who make him a lot more clear. For example, Robert Solomon is a contemporary philosopher. He just passed away, but he's got some tremendous kind of accessible but intellectually sophisticated descriptions. Prior to the internet, we had Frederick Copleston, who has this giant encyclopedic history of philosophy that's also worth reading. So Hegel's worth checking out, but unless you're really a gut for punishment, I wouldn't recommend reading him. Bergson's very readable, right? Whitehead, Process and Reality, another rugged text, right? But because Whitehead is living, he's got, latter-day interpreters who in some ways are more Whiteheadian than Whitehead, right? So that it carries on. It's a lineage and not just Whitehead himself. And of course, his primary sort of student and the person who carried forward his philosophy in the 20th century was Charles Hartshorne, right? And he's definitely exciting to read and very, very good. There's also John Cobb and David Ray Griffin. David Ray Griffin especially, I've gotten a lot of value out of his books. I kind of come to understand Whitehead through Griffin. A book I can recommend by Griffin is a book came out in 2000 called Religion and Scientific Naturalism, Overcoming the Conflicts. But Griffin's got, 30 books. He's also got some baggage, but he was in 9/11, conspiracy theory. But just don't pay attention to that and read the stuff that happened before 2001, and you'll see some great thinking from David Ray Griffin that's thoroughly integral in many ways.
Right on.
So then we have, in the timeline, I also have to mention Sri Aurobindo, or Aurobindo Ghose, who was a giant intellectual. There he is. His book. Let me see if I got some notes on this. His book, The Life Divine, was a major masterpiece that came out in 1939, which talks about the evolution of consciousness by stages, integrates evolution and spirituality in some extremely powerful ways. And Aurobindo is, of course, a venerable sage who we honor to this day. For those of you listening, he's sitting in a big armchair with an Indian sash. He's in a beard, and he's looking very much like the
Indian guru.
When you climb the mountain.
Yeah, exactly.
So Aurobindo, he was significantly influential in that his followers founded the California Institute for Integral Studies, CIIS, right? He refers to his kind of thinking or his practice as integral yoga, right? So he's one of the first adopters of the term integral. It was around the same time that the Harvard sociologist Pitirim Sorokin also started talking about his philosophy as integral, right? And he has stages of evolution and consciousness and culture. And so Sorokin is another one of those, important people that we'd want to list if we were making a list of 100 most influential founders of integral philosophy, but he's not among the top 8 that we're focusing on here. So Aurobindo is good, but of course, Aurobindo, his book, The Life Divine, it's a giant fat tome, and he just proclaims the truth like an all-knowing guru. He doesn't cite anybody. He doesn't mention Hegel. He doesn't mention Bergson. He doesn't mention the evolution of history in any significant way. His main concern is recovering panentheism in the face of Advaita Vedanta non-dualism, right? So he's in conflict with Ramana Maharshi, who was his contemporary, who dismissed Aurobindo as just a kind of a foolish guy. He had disdain for Aurobindo. And Aurobindo had disdain for Ramana Maharshi too, primarily because they have completely different ontologies, right? So Maharshi's a non-dualist and coming from Shankara, right? And of course, in the Hindu lineage, Sri Aurobindo finds his root in Ramanuja, who's the ancient Hindu sage from 1,000 years ago, who was a panentheist, not a pantheist or a non-dualist, right?
Well, so give us the difference between these two, the non-dual and the panentheist, right?
Right. So non-dualism, again, I can't summarize it. Please forgive me, but it's that all.
Steve, let's just pause. Just transmit it to us.
Okay.
Okay. No, tell us about it.
Non-duality is an umbrella term which is a description of ultimate reality that arises in different spiritual lineages, primarily in Buddhism and in the non-dual branch of Hinduism known as Advaita Vedanta. It's also realized independently by other mystics and other religions, example, ancient Sufi mystics, ancient Christian mystics. A lot of it comes from the deep spiritual experience of the unitive experience, or samadhi, right? When you have samadhi, you get a direct experience of non-duality that makes you feel like that's what's really true. And I can understand and I'm sympathetic to that, right?
Yep.
That's a version or an overlap with this idea is what's known as pantheism, which means that everything is God and God is everything and it's just one thing. Panentheism recognizes a philosophical separation, but it's not entirely dualistic, right? So under panentheism, we can have an infinite and a finite, or an absolute and a relative. And it's accommodated philosophically because whatever spirit is, the absolute, is not only transcending the finite realm, it's also permeating it from within. So panentheism means is that God is both everything and within everything and beyond everything. Again, these are very technical philosophical terms, and I'd actually have to prep to do an academically appropriate off-the-cuff definition. But you get the basic idea, right?
Well, with panentheism, to the degree that it includes the relative realm, it's like God is in every living thing, in a particular way, yes. Right? As well as there being the absolute realm that contains everything and is the pure unity.
Right.
And both of these exist at the same time. Right.
So I unpack this quite a bit. I write several chapters about this in my book, The Presence of the Infinite. If people want to know about panentheism and pantheism and non-duality and theism and all that. So Aurobindo, we just want to give him a tip of the hat and say that he was one of the early adopters of the term integral. His philosophy is I think completely integral. He kind of tapped into integral consciousness. He clearly read Hegel. He had a Western education. He was educated in England. So he knew about the heritage of Western civilization. But because he doesn't connect up what he's talking about, he does have a sort of freestanding existence. And so for example, he didn't have a significant impact. Like in India, there's a city dedicated to, or sort of an ashram that's built out called Aurobindo. That's still a retreat you can go to today. But most of the people who are followers of Aurobindo in this time in history regard him in a kind of traditional way. So he's the guru and they're conforming to him. And so that's why he's sort of dead in the water philosophically, right? So Aurobindo really, counts. And the reason that Aurobindo counts, pause that. Next, I want to mention Teilhard de Chardin. And he's one of my sentimental favorites. I was very much taken by Teilhard de Chardin in the 1980s before I even read Ken Wilber. And that is a collar on him. He was definitely a Catholic priest, but he was also a paleontologist. He spent a lot of time in China working on the Peking man, as he was called, and he did a lot of significant work in science. He's also a ambulance driver in World War I. I mean, he has a heroic life, and some friends of mine are trying to produce a movie about him because he's
really cool. Yeah,
features that are very, very cool. But Teilhard de Chardin is one of the most potent founders of integral philosophy because many of the major components that make integral significantly transcendent of both modernity and postmodernity, it comes from the genius of Teilhard de Chardin. And so, for example, he posits the idea that that the emergence of humanity has created a new layer of evolution. Right, so there's the evolution of matter, which he calls the physiosphere, the evolution of life, the biosphere, and then this new layer of evolution, right, which he calls the noosphere. He and a small group of folks, also Vernadsky mentions the term, kind of gets to press before Teilhard with the term, but it's even very, we can definitely say that the noosphere is something that we can associate authentically with Teilhard de Chardin and his genius.
So matter, then life. Then thought, mind, consciousness.
Yeah. Human consciousness, yeah. So Teilhard, because he was a Catholic priest and because his views of evolution were not in keeping with Catholic orthodoxy, was prohibited from publishing his work, right? And so even though many of these ideas he came to at the same time as Whitehead and Aurobindo, his primary book, the phenomenology of the phenomenon of man, or Le Phenomenon Humain, pardon my French, my destruction of that French title, but the phenomenon of man, as it's known in English, came out in 1955, right after Teilhard's death. He gave the manuscript to a friend, and as soon as he was no longer, subject to the control of the Catholic Church, they published it, and it was a huge sensation, and really got the mainstream's attention, both in terms of praise for it, but also, disdain, condemnation of it, right? Because he was a scientist, because he was talking about, the gospel of scientism, evolution, many people kind of said, oh, this book should be burned, right? It's screwing people up. It's bringing them back to religion.
And we're talking the critique from the modernist side, not
from the modernist, right?
Yeah, and probably a critique from his colleagues back at the church.
Well, I think they kind of held their tongue a little bit. It was mostly from scientific materialism.
Okay.
Excoriated. But his influence is continuing. He's influential not just in philosophy, and certainly beyond integral philosophy. And Teilhard de Chardin has influenced law. He's influenced literature. He's influenced sociology. He's got a widespread influence, and he's definitely a major genius in his own right.
And what's he bring to the party? What's his...
So
paragraph?
the idea of the noosphere, the idea
the noosphere, yes.
Evolution being pulled forward by the potential future of what he called the omega point. There's this kind of culmination of the brotherhood of man, Jesus' teaching that is a sort of perfection or a utopian culmination that is sometime in the future that is pulling us towards it. So it has a kind of gravity on us by its future potential. Another really... I love that. Yeah, the omega point.
Yeah, I could feel that.
Yeah, well, it's also, it's been criticized as being deterministic, right? Like, oh, it's already, the omega point's already predetermined, right? But of course, he didn't want to take it that far. He definitely had a view of free will and rejected these idea of dialectical materialism, where it was just thought to come out by material unfolding. So Teilhard also was very influential in his understanding of what he calls his theory of complexity consciousness. Right. So what he posits is that as a structure, specifically an organism, becomes more complex in its body, it becomes more aware in its consciousness. Right. And so this is the sort of the early understanding of interiority. Right. So Whitehead had an understanding of interiority too, but Teilhard came at it from a different angle and talks about this idea of that is consciousness creates the complexity, and the complexity creates the consciousness. So they're co-evolving together. And that they're two sides of the same coin, right? And so that's very much contributes to Wilber's conception later in his quadrant theory. So there's many elements of Teilhard. Again, we're skimming over the top. I'm not intending to provide a summary of any of these folks. But the next person I want to talk about is John Gebser, right? His book, The Ever-Present Origin, came out in 1953. And when he wrote about it, he was neither aware of Teilhard, whose book hadn't been published until 2 years later, or Aurobindo. But then in his second edition in 1966, to the ever-present origin, Gebser in the preface says there have been 2 developments that I've become aware of that validate what I'm talking about and are very promising, and one is Aurobindo and the other is Teilhard de Chardin. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so, like Peter and Sorokin and Aurobindo, Jean Gebser comes up with this term integral and uses it in ways that are very familiar to modern ears, integral ears. And so the fact that he then finds these other people talking about it and validating what he's talking about from different angles begins to feel like we're all talking about the same thing now. There's this thing, right? So Gebser, unlike Teilhard or Whitehead or Bergson or Hegel, Gebser's obscure. He's very esoteric in terms of he's not really recognized as a mainstream contributor to philosophy. He's not in the canon, right? So if you go and look at, the history of philosophy, you're not going to see his name. And, for a lot of reasons, he's quirky, he could be dogmatic, but for integralists and for a core of people who are followers of Gebser to this day, Gebser's a very significant and creative and innovative thinker. And so Gebser, he intuits that in shortly before 1953, like during the war in the 40s, he intuits that soon there's going to be what he calls a mutation of consciousness, a new kind of consciousness. It's a new structure of consciousness that's about to appear, which he calls integral, right? And so that he's got the the stages that he names. Now he's certainly not the first to do that, but I think he comes to recognize the stages independently of the other work in developmental psychology, which I'll come to here in a second. But Gebser says there's this new step. It's going to be called integral. It's going to be able to transcend modernity. It's going to have, while modernity is a perspective that's tied to the ego, this integral stage is aperspectival. It's not tied to any one of these stages and can see through the other stages, right? So he talks about how this integral epistemology, this ability to see these other stages of evolution in the interior of consciousness and culture, is brought about through what he calls diaphanous, translucent, the diaphaneity. That integral consciousness renders these previously opaque structures, you can see clear through them. You can see the values within them, and you can see those values within yourself. So, Gebser's extremely prescient
Wow, that's
understanding of integral consciousness and the fact that it's coming, right? In evolution, we can anticipate it. And so, again, there's a lot more to say about Gebser, but going over the top.
That idea of, first of all, the ever-present origin. So it's happening right now, and the nature of this next stage of being able to embrace, see through, the previous stages.
Right.
That's the emergent thing that is happening.
Yeah.
Again, I can feel that. And that's really powerful.
So Gebser certainly is a significant influence on Wilber and on integral thinking to this day, and he's got his own lineage, by his own right, even though it's kind of obscure, but at the same time, Gebser was wrestling against scientism, scientific materialism. He called these structures of consciousness and their unfolding. He said it's not evolution. Well, I'm not talking about evolution. These are mutations in consciousness. Now, of course, we can say, well, under a broader definition of evolution, we can include it. But I understand, the sort of vice grip that he felt he was in and had to break out of. The other thing about Gebser, which is he was not prescient enough to recognize that beyond modernity, what comes next is not integral, but postmodern, right? And up until, I'm going to get to this very important point, up until about the late 90s, up until about 1995 or 1996, the fact that whatever comes after modernity is not integral consciousness, that was not understood. It was not understood by Gebser. It was not understood by Robert Keegan. It was not understood by Wilber, right? So even in Sexicology, Spirituality, Wilber's major philosophical masterpiece, he talks about postmodernity, but if you follow his chapter on the stages, it goes from, he follows Gebser from modernism to integralism, right? And it was this sort of recognition that there's this kind of intervening postmodern state or stage or whatever it is that has to occur before integral can emerge. That was a linchpin which brought about the current movement or the current phase of the integral worldview's development. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. But so Gebser couldn't see that just thought that, you know, that in some ways, if you can read him and say there's so many things that he is able to predict or prophesize about integral, but many of those same descriptions also apply to postmodernism. So postmodernism and integralism were sort of kludged together in his prophecy, and so, you know, that's where it's deficient. And so beyond Gebser, I sort of want to then begin to trace another line that's not philosophy, this line of developmental psychology that begins with James Mark Baldwin, right, who wrote around the turn of the 20th century. And Baldwin had some very incredible insights. Yeah, there he is. Nobody's heard of Baldwin because he was involved in a sex scandal and he had to leave the country. He was kicked out of American academia. But so much of what we now understand about developmental psychology, as talked about by Jean Piaget or Lawrence Kohlberg or Clare Graves or any of the great developmental psychologists, was almost all there in Baldwin. But the person who we recognize as sort of the father of developmental psychology is Jean Piaget, who wrote about 30 years after Baldwin. And he tries to pretend like he didn't read Baldwin. He didn't kind of get most of his thinking from Baldwin. But in fact, he did, right? He kind of ripped off Baldwin.
Who's this now?
Jean Piaget.
Oh, Piaget, okay.
Yeah. But nevertheless, he made a significant contribution. He experimented on his children.
Right.
In a kind of cruel way.
I should say he's more famous than Baldwin.
Yeah.
Certainly
And began to see that children go through these steps and that they reach post-conventional consciousness or modernist consciousness, concrete Aurobindo. I can't remember all the details of his theory, but Piaget is just in some ways a major founder of developmental psychology. And the most prominent living developmental psychologist is Robert Kegan, who calls himself a neo-Piagetian. Piaget is his primary mentor, okay? And so this thinking about developmental psychology, which runs throughout the 20th century and continues to develop, ends up being one of the catalysts that helps the modern synthesis of integral go beyond Teilhard de Chardin or beyond Gebser even, right? And so part of the way that developmental psychology gets integrated into integral philosophy is through Jürgen Habermas, right? Who's a significant philosopher. He's 88 now, but he's a German professional philosopher with a robust lineage. He's sort of the inheritor of the Frankfurt School, which was a neo-Marxist school of philosophy in Germany that was influential in its own right. His Marxism at this point is somewhat ceremonial. You know, it's sort of just like for philosophical credibility in Europe. But he's primarily a modernist and a big proponent of the European Union. And he, in a sense, is an outlier in the sense that he's an atheist, so he's not really influenced by Bergson or Whitehead or Teilhard. Every philosopher is influenced by Hegel, but that's another story. But what makes Habermas a de facto founder of integral philosophy is a significant influence he had on Ken Wilber, because in his philosophy, especially his 1981 book, what's it called? Theory of Communicative Action, right? Which was followed his 1976 book, Communication and the Evolution of Society. He begins to understand that there's a loose connection between the evolution of psychology and the evolution of human history, right? And the linchpin that he relies on is Lawrence Kohlberg, who was he was a developmental psychologist in the lineage of Piaget in his own way. Piaget was concerned about cognitive development. Kohlberg was concerned about moral development, but they're both tracking the same stages, right? They're similar developments, and of course, Habermas really uses the weight of this, intensely analytical professional philosophy to try to make the case that the moral stages that Kohlberg is identifying have a rough recapitulation or can be seen in the stages of history, with modernity being really, he doesn't go beyond modernity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Modernity is sort of the current age that we're in, according to Habermas and just about, all these other thinkers. But because he's got this very sophisticated philosophy, very validated by professional philosophy, and bringing in this combination of how one is influencing the other, how consciousness and culture are co-evolving, when Habermas is combined with Teilhard de Chardin and Whitehead in Wilber's, grand synthesis in 1995, it's sort of the framing of what I call integral philosophy's 21st century synthesis starts to come together, right? But not complete. There's one more piece, right? So people may be familiar with the management thinker, Peter Senge. He has a famous book, came out in the 90s, called The Fifth Discipline, where he talks about the DC-10, the plane, and how there are these 5 technologies which made the DC-10 a major breakthrough. It was like head and shoulders above any other plane that came before. Then it was because that when they brought about this 5th technology, all the other technologies came together and created a synergy. So the 5th technology, or using this analogy of Peter Senge, that brought integral philosophy into the 21st century and really began a movement, made it exciting, was this discovery that postmodernism was a stage, right? It seems obvious now, right? But again, up until about 1996, again, most of the thinking was we're trying to transcend modernity. Whatever transcends modernity is going to be holistic and wonderful, right? And we could feel, especially in the 90s, that
so there was a lot of feeling of postmodern feeling about that.
Sure. Well, and the birth of a new age, these things all kind of kludge together, right?
Right.
So it was around this time, 1995, that the sociologist Paul Ray published his study of it was a sociological study that had a grant funded. So he tried to do proper social science by getting the right numbers of people and like that. And he was able to find through his survey of American culture that there were 3 major blocks of culture, 3 major worldviews, which he called the traditionalists, the moderns, and the cultural creatives. So he was really the first to popularize or frame the idea that this progressive culture wasn't just the warmed over remnants of the 60s. It was actually a new worldview that could be compared to modernity and traditionalism, right? So just like we can see at least 2 worldviews, the traditional worldview and the modernist worldview, here was framed, it had come of age, this postmodernism, as we call it, green, had come of age on its own. And of course, Paul Ray was a postmodernist, and so we glorified postmodernity as the cultural creatives there.
Oh, I remember. It was a big book here in Boulder back in the time.
Sure.
Back in the
day.
Before
the book came out
very
in 2000.
influential to me.
Right, the book came out in 2000, but the research and the thesis of the book was published by the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1995. And I remember in my little New Age community here in Boulder, we were all excited about it. We could all feel that this was a breakthrough, and it was saying something that we already knew, it just hadn't been articulated, right?
And we were one of the cultural creatives too, by the way.
We were definitely, in it, yeah. Then in 1996, the work of Clare Graves was also published in the book Spiral Dynamics. Graves hadn't written any books. His work was very obscure, but the book Spiral Dynamics kind of brought his thinking to life. There he is, Clare Graves, major founder of integral philosophy.
And he was a psychology professor at a school in New York.
Union College, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, he was an obscure philosopher. And so he was able to discern green, partially because he was following in the footsteps of Maslow, who was another developmental psychologist who was more concerned, famous for his hierarchy of needs, and not in terms of these stages, although he could certainly see and recognize that the hierarchy of needs corresponds to worldviews, but he didn't develop the idea very well. Graves wanted to provide empirical validation for Maslow, right? So Maslow was famous, but he didn't do any research, right? He just thought about Lincoln and his self-actualized friends and just was very anecdotal, right? So Graves wanted to do some actual psychology, empirical research to try to not only validate Maslow, but take Maslow further. And so he does research on college students, his students. And today, by today's standards of social science, that research is no good. It wouldn't have been counted as valid right now. And lost, so it's shaky in terms of the research.
What area are we talking about here again now?
We're talking about Graves's empirical research to try to find the stages of consciousness.
I know, but what era? What time?
60s and 70s.
Okay.
Yeah. So Graves, he as popularized by Don Beck and Christopher Cowan in the book Spiral Dynamics, the green worldview is not only shown to be, described in detail in ways that are certainly still recognizable to this day, but there's stages beyond that that were also posited in Spiral Dynamics, right? So this Spiral Dynamics is a huge breakthrough. Even though if you read it, it's kind of a hokey book. It's sort of masquerading as,
management
theory or organizational development.
I loved it.
It's not philosophically informed. Well, all these other thinkers, these major professional hotshots were looking at it, and they were not able to see what Clare Graves could see with clarity. Graves had this unique view. He got it right in ways that many of these other thinkers, even Habermas, they couldn't see green, right? And that's still the majority of mainstream commentators and pundits can't see green either. They can see it, but they think it's just a religion or a scary ideology. They don't understand that it's a worldview that is what's next.
Yeah, that is in the, fully fleshed out as modernity and traditionalism in earlier stages.
And later, Paul Ray, actually in the 2000 edition of his book, Cultural Creative, says, you know what? My theory is actually explained much better by Spiral Dynamics. So even Paul Ray kind of tipped his hat to Spiral Dynamics to be highly influential, right? And so I came across that book in 1999, started reading it, and was really very excited by it. And then I called my friend and was telling him about it. And he said, oh, you must be talking about Spiral Dynamics. I said, well, how did you know the title of the book? He said, well, I've got a copy of the galleys for Wilber's forthcoming book called The Theory of Everything, and he adopts Spiral Dynamics and incorporates it thoroughly into his philosophy. And I said, oh my God, that is so exciting. Wilber could see it too. And up until then, I hadn't been, I'd read Wilber, but, I kind of felt like he was a spiritual teacher and I wasn't down for his dharma. But when he adopted Spiral Dynamics, I, at the same time, figured, okay, this is the movement that I've been waiting for all my life. I kind of realized that this is what I've been called to participate in. And so this is sort of the birth of this integral movement around 1999, 2000. And this marks the beginning of the Integral Institute. And in the last decade, in the 2000s, this really was a movement, right? It was a market. It had big conferences. There were many different lines within it. There was, a journal. There was the magazine, What is Enlightenment? So it wasn't just Wilberian fan club, right? It was this vibrant movement that had many, many thousands of people interested in it.
Just to place myself in it, I read Ken, I don't know what, early 80s, whenever Up From Eden came out. And I'd been knocking around Boulder for years and looking for a teacher and been in all my friends, they had these gurus and stuff. And none of that really, I couldn't find one. Mm-hmm. And yet I knew there was something that I wanted. And that book was like, wow.
Which one?
Up From Eden.
Up From Eden.
Up From Eden. And, I think the title says it all. I mean, I actually feel like I often say I got 50% of my integral transmission when I laid eyes on it in the bookstore. Up From Eden. Oh my God, we've come up.
Right.
We're growing. We're not fallen.
Right. The title was a microdose.
Yeah, it was. Turned out kind of macro, and it got me. So I was alone. Ken Wilber. I guess you were down the street, but who knew? And he joined with the Integral Institute in 2000.
Well, here in Boulder, again, it was a heady time.
Yeah.
What was a movement 10 years ago has kind of lost some steam. It's important to admit. It's now kind of more of an intellectual community than a vibrant movement. A lot of this comes from lack of...
I would disagree with that, Steve. I mean, you and I get together and consume perfectly legal substances in Colorado and talk about it. I don't want to necessarily get into it.
That's fine.
My goodness, if you think of where the integral movement was in 1995, we read Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, where it was in 2003 when we started doing the Integral Institute seminars, and where it is now in terms of the number of people who are aware of it, interested in it, turned on by it, lit up by it, and also whether or not they've heard of it, people who just have de facto integral thinking. that we can see. It's changed forms, but good Lord, it's bigger and more vibrant than ever.
Well, I'm glad you think that. I don't think this is the place to have that argument. I think there is some sociology about the difference between a movement and an intellectual community. And I don't think it's a huge put down to say that it's an intellectual community. You still have vibrancy, it's still growing in its own way.
Well, it's an intellectual community that is, people are applying it in all kinds of interesting ways.
Sure.
In real life.
Let me say, like you, I have dedicated my life to participating in the worldview that comes after modernism, postmodernism. And I think that the work of Ken Wilber, the work of this other line of thinking that we've talked about, many other contemporary writers and activists who are in this cultural space today, all of us are contributing to it. And clearly, post-modernity is not the end of history, right? I mean, something comes after it. Whether it's going to take another 50 years or whether it's in the next decade, we don't know. But clearly at this point, integral is not rocking the world.
True. But it's gone from microscopic to,
Yeah,
something.
Well, and that may not take, again, we just want to make sure we're not magical postmodern thinking about 2012 regarding to, the global awakening that's on, right? There's a lot of that thinking that is in this integral movement, and we want to be integral and be more skeptical and be more, bring in some modernist consciousness to say, big claims need big evidence. And so right now there's not big evidence that this thing, whatever it is going to be the next worldview that's historically significant in the unfolding of human civilization. But nevertheless, I definitely believe there's something beyond postmodernism, and I think that the integral, it's got to be integral in a lot of ways. There's all these geniuses who've seen it in various dim ways. And so I think we're on to it, and we just have to be loyal, followers of the zeitgeist and see what we can do to contribute. Whether it emerges as historically significant in our lifetime or not is not that important. It's more important that we make sure that we're loyal to it and that we work for it and we realize that our self-actualization is tied in with its actualization.
Right on.
Yeah. So let me just...
So then here we are.
Yeah. So now, Wilber's book, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, was a significant masterpiece of a philosophy book. In this period, in the 21st century, right, he's been writing primarily about religion and spirituality, right? In 2006 was Integral Spirituality, and 2017 was Religion of Tomorrow. He's also got the book on Trump, but he hasn't been focusing too much on philosophy per se, like we saw in Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. And there are a lot of integral theorists and people working with integral, but the philosophical line, I don't want to, I think it's a little early to really identify who comes after Wilber or what philosophers come after Wilber. But I think it is important to mention other thinkers who are very close to integral thinking, who are worth reading for people.
Okay.
One is the philosopher Holmes Ralston. He was a Templeton Prize winner, a big $1 million prize for work in spiritual philosophy. And he's known as a father of environmental ethics. Wilber's theory of holonic ecology, which he talks about in Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, comes directly from Ralston. And Ralston's 1988 book, for which he was awarded the Templeton Prize, is called Science and Religion, A Critical Survey. It's masterful. It's, he's a major genius, right? And so I really recommend Ralston, even though he doesn't have developmental psychology, he doesn't have some of those 5, disciplines that are part of the DC-10. He lacks this understanding of cultural evolution, or at least doesn't talk about it. But like his 2013 book, Three Big Bangs, kind of echoes Teilhard de Chardin when he talks about, of course, the first Big Bang of matter, the second Big Bang of life, and the third Big Bang of human consciousness. And, he provides a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the science that really shows why these 3 things are singularities or novelties that can't be explained. And so Ralston is one of my favorite philosophers, and I think he deserves to be called integral, right? Of course, I mentioned David Ray Griffin, another, he's a Whiteheadian, but very astute, very insightful. He's got a recent book that came out about panentheism, which we talked about, which I can recommend. So Griffith for sure. We might also mention, in the scientific genre, Stuart Kauffman or Thomas Nagel, right? They're not thoroughly integral, but they're recognizing that the creativity of the universe there's something significant about it that we don't understand, and we can't explain it with materialism alone, right? So
now, are they getting any traction in academia?
Well, certainly Thomas Nagel, for sure. Yeah, Thomas Nagel is a prominent professional philosopher, and his book Mind and Cosmos, which came out in 2012, was very much like Teilhard. He was bucking the dogma of scientism, and so he came in for scorn and repudiation and disdain. Burn that book, right? Because you can't question the dogma, right? And even though Nagel's a very well-respected professional philosopher and a staunch atheist, the fact that he says that the Darwinian explanation of evolution's got to be wrong, he's a heretic, right? In the religion of scientism. But again, Nagel's not really, he's not in the direct line of integral, but a contributor. Right. I mean, a lot of people have mentioned Roy Bhaskar, who's recently deceased. His philosophies contributed to critical realism. It was kind of just a Marxist philosophy with some twists. But then late in his life, he took a spiritual turn and went back to his native India and kind of re-embraced Hinduism. So he's sort of a sentimental favorite among people who are, in that lineage. Mm-hmm. But I've seen him, before his death, I saw him speak in London, and I've read his stuff, and I'm not impressed. I don't think he really deserves to be recognized as an integral philosopher. But, some might argue, reasonable minds may differ about that.
Yeah, I don't know too much about him.
Yeah, Bhaskar, but his name might be thrown up there. There's also people you never heard of who are nevertheless interesting contributors to integral. One is Charles Johnston, right? So he talks about cultural maturity, and he has a series of books which are definitely integral. He even uses the term integral, although he doesn't like Wilber because he thinks Wilber's too much of an idealist, too much in the realm of Hegel. But Johnston's very smart, and his books are very good, and nobody reads them, and I think he deserves more attention than he gets.
What's his name again?
Charles Johnston.
Charles Johnson? And
Johnston, the T.
Okay, and his big book is?
Well, he's got a variety of them, but my favorite one is from 1990. It's called Necessary Wisdom. So I could recommend that. Mm-hmm. There are also many other authors and writers of books, Alan Combs, and, people who are familiar within this integral intellectual community. But if you mention one, then you got to mention all 10, and it's just too many to take on. But I think it's important to realize that whatever integral philosophy is, it's not merely Ken Wilber's philosophy, although Ken is certainly a major contributor to it. And in my book, if I can just show it, Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution, I praise Wilber, but also offer some constructive critiques to his philosophy, and that's how philosophy proceeds, is that, it's a ladder of distinctions, right? So as soon as you say that's one thing that's true, it immediately points to the partiality that can lead to more truth, and so that's what I try to do. Yep. It hasn't ingratiated me in the integral community, but that's okay. I've got to do my duty, and that means critiquing.
It has with me, and I'm Wilberian all the way. I mean, sure. I got a transmission from Ken that is beyond sort of words and thought.
I understand.
In a way. So that my heart is there. Let me just finish, and so that's my home, but. My conversations with you that have contradicted or where you differ with Ken have been very also illuminating. And I've learned, I've learned a lot from that tension. And my strategy has been to believe the last one of you I talked to.
Well, and so let me just say what I was saying before, just to affirm that I've learned a lot from Wilber. That when I get it right, I'm standing on Wilber's shoulders. I have great respect for him, but I'm not a Wilberian. I don't, not just because we have different belief systems spiritually, but also, in some important ways that I differ from him. Those critiques are made primarily in integral consciousness, but I also talk about where I differ from him in the presence of the infinite. But again, my goal in talking about the founders of integral philosophy is not to land some huge critiques on Wilber. And most of the people who have critiqued him have done so in a very mean-spirited and disrespectful way. And I agree. Count it among them because, again, Wilber deserves our respect because he's moved the ball.
Yeah.
And so, I know that he is near and dear to your heart. And because you're near and dear to my heart, I'm not going to come on your show and critique Wilber.
No, fair enough. But in our lineage of integral philosophers, let's include Steve McIntosh here. And without, necessarily, dialectic against Ken or whatever, because there's so much as you say, you agree with and stand at his shoulders. But what piece of the puzzle are you bringing to the party here?
Well, for one thing, I am challenging Ken's teaching regarding the stages of evolution beyond humanity, right? So he's got, all these elaborate stages. And I think that...
Well, they're not beyond humanity, though. They're some post-integral stages that, he doesn't really write that much about, honestly.
Well, but if consciousness and culture co-evolve together, and there's no cultural structures beyond integral, then it's hard to imagine how you can have consciousness without the culture. Maybe some...
Well, but the idea is, just all as in history. I mean, there have been people who are spiking. There have been people who are, ahead of the game. And I don't think you would disagree with the idea that integral's not the end. There's going to be post-integral stages, perhaps for a very long time.
Sooner the better.
Yeah, exactly. And so there is some, I think reasonable exploration of those stages that we can do.
Yes, I think it's worth speculating about. But I also think that the consciousness can't get too far ahead, maybe 2 stages ahead. So we could say maybe St. Francis of Assisi had proto-postmodern consciousness, right before the emergence of modernity. You can say Rousseau definitely had proto-postmodern consciousness. So you can get this harmonics, right? But when we start talking about third tier, I just have to balk. I mean, I just can't go there. And so this is not the place or the time frame in which we could really unpack that critique. And in integral consciousness, I mentioned where I differ from Wilber and what I try to add. And while integral consciousness is truly 2 books, one is my own version of an accessible introduction to integral, and then the second half is my attempt to try to contribute. Evolution's Purpose, my 2012 book, that's more of a straight philosophy book in the lineage of Teilhard de Chardin. In other words, along those
such a beautiful book. I love that book.
Thanks. And then The Presence of the Infinite, that one is more theology and cultural observation, although there's some philosophy, informing it. It's not philosophy proper. But there I talk about Wilber's theology a bit and say how I differ from that. And now in this current book that I'm working on politics, on integral politics, I've been working on it feverishly. I'm kind of cross-eyed at the moment from working on it. But I hope to have that done before the end of the year, and then it has to be in the publishing pipeline. But that one is an attempt to bring integral thinking and integral philosophy to bear upon the body of existing political philosophy. Thinking about modernity and liberal values and where things are going. I can't summarize it, but that book is also a political philosophy, and so I hope to make a contribution there.
Well, I hope you come back on the Daily Evolver when you get that thing done.
Great. Well, I hope to come
tell us
before
about
that. I mean, it'll have to be out there for a while, but the Institute for Cultural Evolution, I'm continuing to write and think there, but for the moment, I'm kind of in the writer's cave. So I appreciate you getting me to come out of the cave, eyes blinking.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming out of the cave.
And to talk to you a bit.
Yeah.
And, look forward to obviously being on this wonderful program, the Daily Evolver, frequently, because it's great and I want to support it any way I can.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, just again, laying out this lineage of thought that has sort of, you can look at it as under its own power through these people has just continued to unfold and flourish and bring us to where we are and situate us. And, we could see how we're actually moving it forward and it's moving us forward. And I love, every time I hear the story, it's like, tell me again, Steve, every time I hear it, I get a sort of a better download, and I appreciate it. I'm sure my listeners do
it's
too.
fun to talk about, and it's especially fun to talk about with you. So I'm glad we could broach the subject, and there's more.
Yeah, more to come. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Steve McIntosh. And we'll see you next time on the Daily Evolver.